Spring break is meant to be an escape, sunny beaches, wild road trips, and nights you'll never forget. But for some, the memories aren't just unforgettable, they're inescapable. A car that follows without a driver, a motel room that hides a terrifying secret, a stranger on the beach who was never really there, and an Airbnb where the guests check in. Story 1. The Vanishing Road Trip. The sun dipped below the horizon as the car full of college friends sped down the empty highway, the promise of spring break in Florida fueling their excitement. Jake, the driver, tapped the steering wheel to the beat of the radio while Mia scrolled through a playlist. Ryan cracked jokes from the back seat, Sarah hummed along to the music, and Chris stared out the window, lost in thought. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and the night grew darker with every passing mile. Around midnight, the gas light flickered on. "We need to stop," Jake said, squinting at the GPS. "Next station is 20 miles away. We'll never make it." The group groaned but agreed. Soon, they spotted a dimly lit gas station, its flickering neon sign reading, "Open." The place looked abandoned. Rusted pumps, cracked pavement, and a single flickering bulb above the door. As they pulled in, a tall, gaunt man emerged from the shadows, his hollow eyes fixed on them. He didn't speak, just watched as they filled the tank and hurried inside. The store was eerily quiet. The cashier, an elderly woman with a vacant stare, barely acknowledged them as they grabbed snacks and paid. As they left, Mia glanced back. The strange man was still there, standing motionless, his gaze following them. Back on the road, the mood shifted. Ryan broke the silence. "Did that guy give anyone else the creeps?" "Let's just forget about it," Mia said, though her voice wavered. An hour later, Chris noticed headlights in the rearview mirror. Guys? That car's been behind us for a while." Jake sped up, but the SUV kept pace. He took a sharp turn onto a side road, but the headlights stayed glued to their tail. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, his hands tightening on the wheel. The chase continued for miles until finally the SUV disappeared. Relieved, the group found a cheap motel and crashed for the night. The next morning, they woke to find Sarah missing. Her phone, bag, and shoes were still in the room, but she was gone. Panic set in as they searched the motel and surrounding area, calling her name. As they returned to the car, they froze. Scrawled across the windshield in muddy letters were the words, "You should have never stopped." The police were no help. The gas station they described didn't appear on any maps, and the strange man was nowhere to be found. Desperate, the friends retraced their route, but the road looked different in daylight, empty and unfamiliar. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah was still missing. The group began to unravel. Ryan swore he saw the dark SUV parked outside his apartment. Mia received silent calls in the dead of night. Chris found muddy footprints outside his door. One evening, an old man approached them at a diner. His voice trembled as he spoke. "That gas station, it's not real. People who stop there, they don't come back." Before they could ask more, he vanished. Determined to find Sarah, the group returned to the spot where the gas station had been. As they approached, the air grew heavy, and the road seemed to warp. The gas station materialized, shrouded in darkness. The strange man stood waiting, his hollow eyes gleaming. "You should have never stopped," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. Before they could react, the ground beneath them gave way, and the world went black. The friends were never seen again. Their car was found abandoned, the windshield still bearing the chilling message. The gas station vanished, leaving no trace, except for the whispers of those who dared to stop there. Story 2. The Abandoned Motel Incident. The highway stretched endlessly into the night. the car's headlights cutting through the thick darkness. Emma and Mark were supposed to be celebrating their anniversary at a luxurious beach resort, but fate had other plans. Overbooked and frustrated, they were redirected to a motel in the middle of nowhere, the Sunset Inn. The motel loomed into view, its flickering neon sign buzzing like a dying insect. The building was a relic of the past, its paint chipped, windows cracked, and parking lot eerily empty. The air smelled of damp earth and something metallic, like rust or blood. The receptionist was a gaunt woman with sunken eyes and a voice that sounded like it hadn't been used in years. She handed them a key with a trembling hand. "Room 13. It's the only one available." Emma hesitated. "Room 13? Isn't that bad luck?" The woman's lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile. "It's just a number." The room was cold, despite the summer heat outside. The wallpaper was stained and peeling, the carpet damp underfoot. The bed creaked when Mark sat on it, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and something worse, something rotten. Exhausted, they fell asleep quickly. But at 2 a.m., Emma woke to the sound of whispers. "Mark," she whispered, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" The voices were faint, but unmistakable, low, guttural murmurs that seemed to come from the walls. They sounded angry, desperate, almost inhuman. Mark sat up, his face pale. "Maybe it's the wind," but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Words began to form. "Get out! You don't belong here! Leave while you can!" Emma's heart raced. "We need to complain!" They hurried to the front desk, but the receptionist was gone. The office was dark, the chair empty. A cold draft swept through the lobby, carrying with it the faint sound of laughter. Suddenly, the receptionist appeared behind them, her hollow eyes wide with fear. "You're in room 13? "Yes," Mark said, his voice shaky. "We're hearing voices. What's going on?" The woman's face twisted into a mask of terror. "That room has been closed for 2 years. No one's supposed to stay there." Emma's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about? You gave us the key." The receptionist's voice dropped to a whisper. "A family was murdered in that room, a man, his wife, and their little girl. They say the killer never left." Before they could respond, the lights flickered, and the receptionist vanished. The lobby was empty, the desk covered in a thick layer of dust. Panicked, Emma and Mark ran back to their room. The door creaked open, revealing a scene straight out of a nightmare. The room was no longer the same. The walls were stained with dark, dried blood, the furniture overturned, and the air thick with the stench of decay. On the nightstand sat an old, dust-covered photograph. Emma picked it up, her hands trembling. It was a picture of their room, but it looked abandoned, covered in dust and cobwebs. And in the corner of the photo, barely visible, was a shadowy figure, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes, staring directly at the camera. "Mark," Emma whispered, her voice breaking. "We need to leave. Now." They grabbed their bags, but the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the room with a cacophony of screams and laughter. The lights flickered, and the shadowy figure from the photo materialized in the corner of the room. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "Get out!" it hissed, its voice echoing like a chorus of the damned. Mark grabbed a lamp and hurled it at the window, shattering the glass. "Go!" he shouted, pushing Emma toward the opening. They climbed through, cutting their hands on the broken glass, and ran to their car. As they sped away, Emma glanced back at the motel. The neon sign flickered and went dark, and the building seemed to collapse in on itself, swallowed by the shadows. The police found no trace of the Sunset Inn. The road where it had been was overgrown, as if no one had traveled it in decades. Emma and Mark never spoke of that night again, but the photograph remained, a haunting reminder of the room that shouldn't exist. Sometimes, late at night, Emma still hears the whispers, and when she closes her eyes, she sees the shadowy figure, watching, waiting. Story 3. The Uninvited Beach Stranger. The sun was setting over the pristine beaches of Cancun, casting a golden glow over the turquoise waves. A group of friends, Emma, Jake, Sarah, and Chris, were living their best lives, lounging on the sand with cocktails in hand. The resort was luxurious, the music was loud, and the vibe was perfect. But as the night deepened, Emma noticed a man sitting a few feet away, staring at them. He was tall and gaunt, with sunken eyes and a hollow expression. He didn't speak, didn't move, just sat there, watching. "Creepy," Sarah muttered, glancing at him. "Should we say something?" "Just ignore him," Jake said, shrugging. "Probably some weirdo trying to ruin our vibe." They tried to brush it off, but the man's presence was unnerving. Every time they looked up, he was still there, his eyes fixed on them. Eventually, they packed up and headed back to their rooms, laughing off the encounter. The next morning, Chris was gone. At first, they thought he'd gone for an early swim or a walk, but when he didn't show up for breakfast, they started to worry. His phone went straight to voicemail, and his bed hadn't been slept in. Panicked, they reported his disappearance to the resort staff. The manager, a stern woman with a no-nonsense attitude, agreed to check the CCTV footage. The video was grainy, but the timestamp showed 2:17 a.m. Chris was walking alone on the beach, clearly intoxicated. Behind him, the same creepy man from the night before appeared, following silently. Chris turned, as if sensing someone behind him, and the man gestured toward the water. The group watched in horror as Chris nodded, seemingly in a trance, and followed the man into the darkness. The footage cut off as they disappeared into the shadows. "Who is that guy?" Emma demanded, her voice shaking. The manager's face turned pale as she pulled up the resort's guest records. After a few tense minutes, she looked up, her expression grim. "That man, he was a guest here 15 years ago. He disappeared under mysterious circumstances. No one ever found him." The room fell silent. "But that's impossible," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How can he be here now?" The manager shook her head. "I don't know. But this isn't the first time something like this has happened. Guests have reported seeing him over the years, always late at night. And every time, someone goes missing." The friends were in shock. They spent the rest of the day searching the beach, the resort, and the nearby town. But there was no sign of Chris. That night, they stayed in their rooms, too terrified to go outside. But as the clock struck 2 a.m., Emma heard a knock on her door. "Emma," a voice whispered. It was Chris. She rushed to the door, but Jake grabbed her arm. "Don't! What if it's not him?" The knocking grew louder, more insistent. "Emma, let me in, please!" Against her better judgment, she opened the door. Chris stood there, drenched and shivering, his eyes wide with fear. "I saw him," he said, his voice trembling. "He took me to the water. I don't know how I got back." Before they could react, the lights flickered and the room grew cold. The creepy man appeared in the doorway, his hollow eyes glowing faintly. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. The friends screamed as the man lunged forward, his hands reaching for Chris. They slammed the door shut, but the knocking returned, louder and more frantic. The next morning, Chris was gone again. This time, there was no trace of him, no CCTV footage, no witnesses, nothing. The resort staff refused to discuss it further, and the police found no evidence of foul play. The friends returned home, haunted by what they had seen. But sometimes, late at night, Emma hears a faint knock on her door, and when she looks through the peephole, she sees Chris standing there, drenched and shivering, with the creepy man lurking behind him, his hollow eyes glowing in the dark. Story 4. The Creepy Airbnb Host. The cabin was perfect, too perfect. Nestled deep in the woods, it was the ideal getaway for Emma, Jake, Sarah, and Chris. The Airbnb listing had glowing reviews, and the price was unbeatable. Only one review stood out. Something's not right about this place. But they ignored it. When they arrived, the host, Mr. Grayson, greeted them with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Make yourselves at home," he said. "If you need anything, just call. But I doubt you will. This place has everything you need." The first night started off great. They cooked dinner, played games, and laughed late into the night. But as they settled into bed, the atmosphere shifted. Emma woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of footsteps creaking on the wooden floor. She sat up, her heart pounding. "Jake, did you hear that?" He groaned, half asleep. "It's just the house settling. Go back to bed." But the footsteps continued, growing louder. Then a faint whisper echoed through the hallway. "You're not alone." Emma froze. "Did you hear that?" Jake sat up, now fully awake. "Yeah, stay here." He grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the hallway, but there was no one there. The house was silent. The next morning, Chris was gone. "Maybe he went for a walk," Sarah suggested, though her voice trembled. But his phone, wallet, and shoes were still in the room. They searched the house and the surrounding woods, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. Panicked, they called Mr. Grayson. He arrived within minutes, his expression unreadable. "Are you sure he didn't just wander off?" he asked. "We've looked everywhere," Emma said, her voice breaking. "He's gone." Mr. Grayson sighed. "I'll notify the authorities, but don't worry. Sometimes guests get lost in the woods. They always turn up." His calm demeanor only made Emma more uneasy. That night, Jake noticed a small, blinking red light in the corner of the living room. He climbed onto a chair and pried it off the wall. A hidden camera. "What the hell?" he muttered. They searched the house and found more cameras. In the bedrooms, the bathroom, even the closet. "This is insane," Sarah said, her hands shaking. "Who does this?" Jake connected one of the cameras to his laptop and pulled up the footage. What they saw made their blood run cold. The video showed Chris sleeping in his bed. Slowly, the closet door creaked open, and a man crawled out from underneath the bed. It was Mr. Grayson. He stood over Chris, whispered something in his ear, and led him out of the room, without any resistance. The group confronted Mr. Grayson the next morning. "We found your cameras," Jake said, his voice trembling with anger. "We saw what you did to Chris." Mr. Grayson smiled, his eyes cold. "Sometimes, guests never leave." Before they could react, the doors and windows slammed shut. The lights flickered, and the house seemed to come alive. Shadows moved on their own, and the whispers returned, louder and more menacing. Emma and Jake fought to survive as the house turned against them. They discovered a hidden basement filled with photographs of past guests, all of whom had vanished. In the end, only Emma and Jake made it out alive. They stumbled into the woods, battered and terrified, as the cabin burned behind them. The police found no trace of Mr. Grayson or the cabin. The property was listed as vacant, and the Airbnb listing had vanished. But sometimes, late at night, Emma hears whispers. And when she looks out her window, she sees a shadowy figure standing in the distance, smiling.